Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
It is indeed showtime. Welcome in. It is the 8th day of May, a Thursday, just ahead of 9 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. If you're listening to this otherwise, that's why this might sound like things have changed since we recorded it, because, we kind of do it in time. Welcome in. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Dave Trafford here with you. And we got a lot of feisty response from our feisty episode last week. It was good fun. And I got to say, overwhelmingly, the response was, wow, that was fun. And the other side of it was nice to hear that people could have opposing and passionate perspectives on stories of the day, and then come away with it, with some level of, good level of respect and so on that went with the discussion. So, and I'm afraid some of those stories are going to drop back into the conversation today. So let's get at it. Around the table here, John Wright is here. He is our veteran pollster, our founding pollster at On the Ledge. Keith Leslie is back, and he is here from Indigenous, Nova Scotia, and Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario. And I want to say right off the top that Tim Hudak was not able to join us, and it was not a no mass thing in this case. It wasn't like he really taken a beating last week. By no contrary, he had some stuff he had to get done today, so at the last minute had to jump out. But even the texts I got back, Kathleen, from Tim on the exchange last week, especially about the elected judges, and I think that really struck at the core of the conversation around what kind of Ontario do we want, what kind of Canada do we want, and let's suggest for a second that both perspectives are legitimate. I mean, Tim came at it from that idea that, this is what Parliament should be doing, etc. You and John came at it from the perspective of, we've got institutions in place to keep Parliament in check. And so I think in and of itself, just that level of conversation and the nature of that one made the point all around that we got to have that holistic discussion always. We need to be looking at this from a 360 perspective always, because as soon as we start to eliminate your point of view, I become the human algorithm that just creates my own echo chamber.
Right. Exactly. It's great to have a forum in which to have that conversation, because it often doesn't happen, or it very rarely happens. And so I'm happy to be part of it. I'll try to keep my temper in check this week, however.
It was just vigorous. That's what we want.
Vigorous, that's right.
For sure.
It was informed and vigorous. That's
well,
good.
what you might not know is that we were at an event last Friday, and there's a friend of mine who is a Superior Court judge, and that's the first thing he said to me. I heard your podcast. Talking about you bleeding heart judges. And so it strikes a nerve. Keith, you listened to it. Your perspective on it was?
I was really sorry I missed it, that I wasn't able to participate in last week's debate, because it was fascinating. It really was. As you say, the passion on both sides. And surprisingly, I think I skewed slightly a little more to Tim's side of the argument, I think. But not whole way, all the way. But I do think that the Premier as well had a point, not on elected judges, but on dealing with the bail system. This is where I think the system is broken. I don't believe Canada is broken, but I do believe the bail system. When we hear that people being arrested for house invasions and for thefts and for all these sorts of crimes, they were already out on bail on another charge, on sometimes many times. I thought the understanding was you were granted bail on condition that you would agree to these conditions, and one of which would be not committing any more crimes. The moment you do violate your bail conditions, why are you not back in jail permanently? If you're facing more charges, why are you not in jail until your first court date? I just don't understand that. So I think from that perspective, the judges are being too lenient. But I think, again, as I say, I do agree with the overall position that there has to be checks and balances on the Parliament, on the laws passed by the Parliament, and that's what the judges are there for. We don't want elected judges. We do not want partisan political judges. It's just not going to work in our system at all. That's a horrible thing, I think. And to have them, out fundraising and trying to get reelected. No, That's the American style politics we absolutely do not want. But we do want to have judges in a position where they can, overrule the laws if the laws are unjust or violate the Constitution. And then there's always that, notwithstanding clause out, which, as we've said, is getting more and more use. But it shouldn't be used as much as it has been. And I think it will go back to being, tempered down as long as things are reasonable and judges do start jailing people who get arrested when they're already out on bail.
I don't want to relitigate the whole thing, John, but the story today is that the Ford government is going to appeal that decision, the injunction to, delay the removal of the bike lanes in Toronto. And to your point, that's exactly how it should go.
Yeah, I'm glad that they are appealing it. It's going to be a controversial decision and get appealed probably to the Supreme Court, regardless, right? The bikers will appeal it or they'll appeal it. So it's going to go up. And it actually does have a fundamental issue dealing with the Charter of Rights. But it's kind of preemptive. It sort of says, if you remove something, then I will likely, be hurt or killed, therefore don't remove it. If that applied to everything in our society, it would be not only controversial, but may bring whole projects and other things to a dead halt. So, as I said last time, there were arguments that the government were using that were somewhat in favor of, or could be used by the bikers. And as we all argued last week, if this is a fundamental issue of law, then it should follow its due course. Where we were disagreeing was whether or not the politics of calling it out as, biased judges and they should be replaced by an electoral system was really at the heart of the feistiness, but really at the soul of it was, we have a process, it's going to be appealed. It's not about this individual judge. Even when I read it, I felt that it should be at least looked at. I think the other thing was, it was also in the past week, we saw the province appoint a whole series of judges. And this is welcome because we know that some of those courtrooms have had even attempted murder trials that have been thrown out because they haven't had any time to make it through the actual judicial process. So that's important. We have to recognize we don't have enough judges. We also don't have enough protection under the current bail system. But also what should be said is, even when that was put in by Harper or Prime Minister Harper and others, the Supreme Court has thrown it out and said you can't have this kind of system. So each one of these things is separate, but they are combined into a judicial system, which requires more judges, more places to look after people if they are going to be housed in our criminal system. And they also require a good look at the law in terms of what can be applied to today's circumstances and not hurt the rights of individuals who may be innocent. So these are all complicated things, but I think the province got off to the right start this week by A, appealing it, which it should do, and B, appointing the judges. I think it was 10 of them that they had appointed to the judiciary, because we need more of them. And the more judges we have and the more places we have, then we're going to have more involvement in the judicial system. But you also, if you're going to keep people in jail, we have a correctional system right now, which is just terrible. If you read about it, it needs an overhaul. So it's all got to go together. And that's, we seem to be dealing with it in separate parts.
Kathleen, this nature of this conversation, though, is one of those things where I think generally the public looks at it and kind of puts it aside, and they really don't pay attention to it until it kind of blows up in the media or on a podcast or whatever it might be. And then it becomes very difficult. I mean, we've got everybody's attention on this, but it becomes very difficult to get down in the weeds and not feel like you're explaining or lecturing to somebody, rather than saying, this is how the system works, and it's messy.
Yeah. And, to your point about it's not something people pay attention to. I remember early on when I was an MPP, one of the people, I think it might've been even Jim Bradley, somebody had been there for, 100 years, said to me, that there's certain issues that it's very hard for a government to pay attention to or to work on, because there's no public permission for it. Nobody worries about people in jail. Nobody's really interested in, as you say, Dave, until something horrendous happens, and then the public's eye turns to that. But if you say you're going to put $50 million into jail reform in terms of programs that are available to people who are sitting in remand, for example, for 2 years. And they, you look at the literacy rates of people who are in jail, and they need language programs, they need literacy nobody cares. And people will say, well, why would we be spending that money on, teaching people to read? Well, because if someone learns to read while they're in jail, they're actually going to reintegrate much better into society. But to your point, Dave, that takes time to explain, and it's not a sympathetic population, and so you sort of have to expect that governments and institutions will do their bit. It's great that there are 10 judges who have been appointed, and I was making that point in the context of that last week, John, that the government had fallen behind in terms of appointments, and that backlogs the system. That makes it difficult for cases to go through. That means that there's more potential that people will get out, or that cases won't be heard. So yeah, it's a layered problem, and until there's a crisis, there's very little public permission for governments to make it an issue.
Yeah, and I think that's the real challenge all the way around. We can pick any topic. I mean, I know you had your share on your desk in terms of the things that you would have taken slings and arrows for because the government, it was out of your peripheral vision. There were other things that you guys had to deal with. And I mean, we can throw autism on the desk, and every government has had the challenges of dealing with it, and it can be rightly accused of ignoring it.
Well, I'm just going to take you up on that one.
I know you would.
we did not ignore autism. We, from the time I was Minister of Education, from 2006 to 2010, I was on that file. We were working to improve the system. We put in place millions of dollars of support. We changed the way people could access support for their kids. We changed the way the wait list works. And quite frankly, all that work that was done up until 2018 kind of got undermined by the current government. They didn't move forward. They put some more money in, but they didn't continue to modify the system and provide access for kids in a timely way. And they didn't move towards what I think needs to happen is better integration between the programs that are offered in schools and the programs that are offered in the community. There's a tension between those. Anyway, it's kind of a don't get me started on this one, Dave, because there's so much work that was done and there's so much still that needs to be done, but it has been neglected. And I would argue it's different than the judicial system. It's different than the criminal justice system in that people do understand that little kids need support. They're a more sympathetic population than criminals, for sure, but they are a subset of the population of children. So you're right. It's harder, to get a focus on those kids with special needs than it is on the entire population of kids.
Last week we were talking, Keith, about the Giovanni going for the jugular in his election speech, and I know we touched on it the last time you were on, just after the election, and it was back and forth, and everybody had the knives out in the phone booth and everything else. And I think John Wright had suggested somebody needed just to kind of calm down. The premier came out the next day and said, "Okay, can we just chill for a second?" And then the story this week is that Conservative leader Poilievre has reached out to the premier. So it sounds as though the water has gone from a rolling boil down to a bit of a simmer.
They put it a little bit further back, I think, although apparently no reach out to Premier Houston's office yet in Nova Scotia, but they have indeed reached out to Doug Ford, and the premier came back with, they're phoning everybody. They're doing what they need to do now. So I'm willing to work with everybody. I'm willing to move on. So Ford's saying all the nice things now about Poilievre, but he's still not, they said, should he be running in an Ontario riding where he's been for 20 years? I'm not going down that road. He's staying well out of it. He's not going to criticize Poilievre anymore at this point. I think he's going to let him try and rebuild relations with Conservatives across the country. If I could just for a second go back to the autism file, I do want to say that I remember going back as far as when Tony Clement was the health minister under Ernie Eves, I guess. It might have been under Harris. And parents with autistic children in those days literally had to give up custody to get them treatment. And that's been changed, thank God. And then the Liberals did put a lot of money and a lot of effort into getting the proper types of treatment and therapies, but the waiting list kept growing. So the Conservatives, when they came in 2018, they decided to overhaul the system, and then quite frankly, they screwed it up royally. And the waiting list is now something like over 60,000 kids. And the providers who weren't getting work left. I mean, Kathleen said, it's way more complicated. It is way more complicated, but the system has been almost undermined completely. So the waiting list is getting longer, not shorter, and the need for those children to get help is, as I say, is growing all the time. And the integration with the public school system it's not happening, and it needs to happen on a much bigger basis. But the schools can't handle it right now either. It's a funding issue as much as anything else. I'm sure I went back on that autism file, but it's something I covered a lot over the years, and I saw some real screw ups in the program. And I think the Conservatives absolutely did make it worse, unintentionally, but they have made it worse.
Well, and in fact, I go back to the whole election campaign, and if the opposition had wanted to weigh in, there were subjects like that, that should have been front and center, and they should have pounded away on it, because it wasn't Trump, but it was one of those things that's, people are dealing with on a daily basis, on a very personal level, on a financial level, on a family stress level, all those things. So there were ways in, and I think they kind of fumbled the ball on that opportunity. Tuesday, big day, Washington. John, we had the Prime Minister visiting the Oval Office. He was late for the meeting. I have a thought on that. But coming out of the meeting, the premiers apparently, according to Doug Ford, we're all thumbs up for the Prime Minister's performance. And in fact, the premier, in his own way, said bland work for the PM.
I don't think I'd have the restraint that he had yesterday, to be very frank. But in saying that, I think it's a good start on a new relationship. I saw President Trump said really kind things when he just tweeted out. So that's good. It's good for the country. It's good for the U.S. Had an opportunity to speak to the U.S. ambassador this morning and get his take on things. I think everyone's feeling relatively good on the meeting yesterday.
Yeah, back to from a rolling boil back to a simmer, and then almost in the same breath, he kind of pushed out and said, "We just had our meeting with the first ministers on the phone," and he thought again, thumbs up for Carney for setting up the meeting with the first ministers, not in Ottawa, but in Saskatchewan.
I think Prime Minister Carney did a really good job in really reaching out to the West, and I was pretty blunt. I said, it's time that your government starts showing some love to Saskatchewan and Alberta, because as I said, like, the last Prime Minister showed no love, matter of fact, to the contrary. So it's nice that we're heading out there to Saskatchewan for an FMM meeting I think it's on June the 1st and June the 2nd, which is a good olive branch, and had a good discussion. So I'm a big believer of pipelines, big believer of getting rid of C-69, and we need to unite this country. And the way we're going to unite this country, as I mentioned to the Prime Minister in front of the premiers, show some love to the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and let's start diversifying our trade when it comes to oil.
Well, and we're going to get to the interprovincial trade barriers in a minute, John, but this is back to Captain Canada, not quite wearing the leotard and the cape, though, but he's more of the mild-mannered Clark Kent version of Captain Canada.
I don't know. I think there's a few things here. First of all, I said on last week's podcast, which is played on the Saturday, that we really, didn't know who this Prime Minister is. Like, I really don't. We think during the course of an election campaign, there's a platform that's being prepared by the party. He gets handed it. He's parroting things. I don't know whether he believes that or he's just campaigning. But in the press conference that he held, I thought it was superb. Like, he really, when he laid out what he's going to do and the priorities and how he answered questions, I got the sense, people may criticize me, but I got the sense he's kind of a right of center liberal. Like, he is, I'm waiting for the economic approach to all of this. But I think it's that phrase, different horses for different courses. I think he's dealing with Trump in one way, and he's going to have to deal with with the premiers in another way, and we're learning how he works. I don't know if it was anybody else who noticed it, but when I saw him sitting beside Trump in the president's Oval Office, I thought his hair got a lot grayer. I don't know whether it was just the lighting in it or something, but you know, he's a man who's caught in a vortex between people trying to bash his door down. He's holding off Trump on one side. He's got Daniel Smith on the other side. He's got other people, and he's trying to figure this all out. He's only been in power for a short period of time. So there's the substance of politics, and then there's the personality of politics. And it's very difficult to distinguish between the two, because you can have an absolutely great platform, but if people don't like you or how you act in a campaign trail, I mean, who cares about your substance? I think I'm going to say that we're just getting to know this individual. It's not like they've been in politics for, 10 years and we've seen them in different circumstances. We're going to see this individual who's got a lot of expectations put on their shoulders. And I think his time in the Oval Office and how he dealt with, come on, forget about just the meeting and the thumbs up pictures that came afterwards. I hope people saw the video that the White House put out later that day. It was incredible. I'd be showing that on Canadian television. It was praising him and Canada, and it was an amazing video. Look, I don't know how many leaders leave that office and get thumbs up, positive stuff being said, get to say to somebody, it's not for sale ever, like just paused and in the right way said it, gets praise across the board, returns to Canada, and kind of goes, well, put that fire out for a moment. Now I got to turn to the separatism in the rest of the country. Like he's got a lot of expectations on him. And every time I see him, I'm waiting to find out how he's going to deal with this situation. And so far, my impression is really great. Even the Conservatives have said that his performance was really great. So substance matters, but I think tone and how the personality is matters as much or more. And I think he's passing the grade right now.
Well, Kathleen, that we suggested a couple of weeks ago that the first priority for the Prime Minister was to look west. And aside from the trip to Washington, that's pretty much what he's doing. And I think it's interesting to hear his primary cheerleader on this, take care of the West, is Doug Ford. That's an important part of this whole image around, as John describes it. What can we expect from the Prime Minister? If you can expect Doug Ford to be in his corner and not just getting along, he's actually really, Doug made the point, and the Premier or the Prime Minister acknowledged it, and we're meeting in Saskatoon.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think that all the right notes are being struck right now. I feel really good about it. I loved watching the conversation in the Oval Office, and I don't know if you guys noticed, but Carney was he was on the edge of his seat, and he had one leg forward. He reminded me of being in the blocks in a race, like he was ready to go at any moment if there was an opening. He was waiting for an opportunity to make his point. And I've heard a stat that the meeting was 30 minutes and he spoke for 3, Carney spoke for 3, and President Trump spoke for 27. Well, so our Prime Minister was waiting for those 3 minutes. So I think he did brilliantly. And I think Ford, he's still in the chair of the Council of the Federation for the next couple of months until it changes in the summer. I think that's how it works. And so I think it's absolutely appropriate that he would be signaling this message of unity. I think that he has to sit around the table with the premiers. There's clearly tension that has kind of escalated a bit between him and Danielle Smith. And so I think that he needs to move back to that message of we all need to work together, and do his own outreach in terms of being the chair of the council to Danielle Smith. And I think that's kind of what he was trying to do to get himself back into the story in that way when he was talking about the meeting in Saskatoon. So well, I think it's going well. I think so far things are going well, and it is happening quickly. We're only talking about a few days. So a lot has to be packed into this first couple of months.
So Keith, back to being on the edge of your seat, the prime minister may have, the body language experts may have looked at that and said, "There's a guy who's just, kind of anxious to get involved in the conversation," but he included it in the conversation because Trump dropped some random thought about how we're going to have the biggest announcement ever before we leave for wherever we're going next week, and it could come on Thursday or Friday or maybe on Monday before we leave. And Carney's first answer was, "You've got me on the edge of my seat," right? So he kind of played that right into the conversation. But the other side of this is he was late for the meeting. And the commentary on the news networks was, "Oh, he's never late. He's a punctual guy. He's always on time." And just before he went into that meeting, Trump unleashed some post on Truth Social, and it was essentially, all about all the benefits that Canada would have if we were all Americans and so on. And I was talking to somebody in studio. We were doing a recording, and I said, "I'm willing to bet that somebody in the Canadian office is saying, hello, this is how this conversation is going to go. Otherwise, we're going to ghost you." Now, that might be extreme, but the idea that he kind of played that opportunity to be late on purpose to put them on their back heels. I've seen people suggesting that was a strategy that kind of the White House had to take knowledge of.
These are deeper thinkers than I. I mean, it could indeed have been a strategy, but to me, what I saw was a master class in Mark Carney on how to handle Donald Trump. Any world leader should be running that video from the opening statement. You're a transformational president. That's like saying you're interesting. You're changing the world, and I'm going to come along with it. It was a brilliant opening statement. And then to be able to sit there, and Doug Ford acknowledged, he said, "I wouldn't be able to sit there and stay as quiet as he did when Trump not only went off on tangents, but then he started attacking, Chrystia Freeland. He couldn't remember her name, but he was clearly attacking her. And sort of halfway through his rant, he realized he was attacking her for getting the better of him in the first USMCA deal. And so he couldn't go that far. So he just went off on it. But Carney sat there. He didn't try and interject or correct him. He didn't say, we are the largest trading partner, when Trump said we hardly do any trade with Canada. It was all perfectly done, I think. And again, the outcome, the result was what everyone wanted to see, and a shocking result with the White House video that was put out. No one saw that coming, let alone, the thumbs up pictures are great. But the fact that Trump was just, so effusive afterwards and said he had a really good meeting, very positive, they're going to be able to work together. I think all of Canada had a big sigh of relief. Okay, good. We can just, move on and perhaps deal in a normal manner with that. And so the Prime Minister came back, and right away was, of course, faced with the premiers and let's deal with some Alberta separatist sentiment and what's going on out there, and Saskatchewan as well. And I think, Doug Ford weighing in and, first criticizing Danielle Smith for even mentioning separation referendums. But then all of a sudden yesterday, what did we see? He's showing the love and saying the Prime Minister has showed the love to Alberta and Saskatchewan both. Because Ford, again, he's putting on that Captain Canada cape in a sense that the premiers, we've all got to be united on this. And he's, we got to scrap C-69. We got to build pipelines. He's saying all the things that Alberta wants to hear. And he's saying that Carney has to say these same things. So that's real interesting. It's showing some leadership at that table, but it also shows a speech earlier this week when he himself brought up Trump's name. He said, "Oh, that man riles me up. Come the midterms, we'll fix his little red wagon." I mean, he's still in that attack mode, and I don't think that's helpful, quite frankly. I think you should let Carney, after having established a pretty darn good relationship, step back until we need the attack dog to come in again when there's some other reason for it. But right now, I thought that was a bit of a misstep. But overall, it's quite interesting to watch Doug Ford clearly trying to say, "There's no problem between me and Danielle Smith." No, you're misinterpreting what I said there. He's trying to really, really, unite the premiers, and that's a laudable goal. Whether it's an achievable one will be interesting to see. But he seems to think he can get Quebec to agree to pipelines as well. The polling showing they're all in favor too. So it's going to be interesting.
Dave, there's an international part to this too that is just off the periphery that's really worth watching. Because, when Mark Carney went to his first places were to visit with the British Prime Minister and then with President Macron again, and who knows what was going on in those discussions, but it may have been on, U.S. Treasury bonds and whether or not they were going to consolidate them and in the back way kind of say, Mr. Trump, if you don't listen to us, we can always pull all of that out. But there was an interview published yesterday, or, for our listeners a couple of days ago, by the Chancellor of Germany. And he was in a way speaking on behalf of Europe and said it was a master class in how, we're all watching Canada. And they'd said to Mark Carney, they said, Canada has to know that we have their back in all of this, because threatening another country in terms of its sovereignty or trying to take over somebody is just not on, and we're going to do what we can through that to make sure they're protected. So we're seeing it through the lens of, Canada and the United States. And I won't go down the route. I don't know how Pierre Poilievre would have acted in that meeting or how he would have been perceived. I'm just glad with what happened and how it did. But there's a whole other thing going on here where Mark Carney, because of his relationships with all of those other leaders in the world, because of his work with the EU and the Bank of England and all of that stuff, people are watching, and I think they had a big sigh of relief, because the chancellor says he taught us a lesson on how to deal with Donald Trump. So this is not just about our country. This is about a whole range of others who are opening the door and saying, you know what, Carney, you're doing a great job. If we've got your back, if you need anything, and he'll probably turn and say, hold my beer for a moment. I got to go deal with something else. But honestly, I'd like an increase in my trade with you on this and this and this. So I think it's really, really important to us to realize that his hair was grayer when he went into that room, and maybe a lot grayer when it came out, because he's got this weight that it's not just our country. So many others in the world are actually watching this, and he performed exceptionally well.
The interesting thing for me, Kathleen, was I saw commentary this week on that meeting. And to John's point, there were other international leaders looking at it, but there were also never Trumpers and Democrats who were saying, oh, that's how you do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I completely agree with what John has said in terms of the world watching, and just to go back to the domestic scene for a second. I think the other thing that's happening is the Captain Canada mantle is shifting, right? So once Prime Minister Trudeau stepped down, there was a vacuum at the top, and Doug Ford kind of stepped into that as a placeholder, and he did a good job. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he didn't, but he did a good job within his ability to do that job. But now we've got someone who actually can hold that space, can hold it in a way that goes way beyond our borders. And so I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing that shift happen, which is also why, the premiers who are aligned with Prime Minister Carney are going to be, they're going to be eager to be working with him at the First Minister's meeting. So I think that shift, it's not even subtle. I think it's pretty obvious what's happening, that, we've got now someone who is doing what people wanted him to do when they voted for him. When I was knocking on doors in the number of ridings I was in, people were saying, we think that this man is reasonable. He can be the adult in the room. And that's the kind of language that was used after the meeting with Trump. So he's fulfilling the expectations so far of people across the country, I think.
One of the things that came up again this week was based on the call with the First Ministers, Keith, and you've already alluded to it, is this, who's getting along with whom, but it was all done against the backdrop of the conversation on interprovincial trade. The Prime Minister's already said he wants one market, not 13 markets by Canada Day. The Premier, Ford, is being rather bullish on all of that. Let's to use his vernacular, get it done now.
Yeah, we did. We actually had that discussion. He said by July the 1st, but I said, let's all the premiers, let's get together, at least sign all the MOUs. So, who's coming up in the batting cage? PEI, Saskatchewan. Hopefully, I just text Scott right now and said, hey, let's sign that deal. Even Danielle, we're texting back and forth, and she wants to sign an MOU too. So, we do get along, by the way, just to let you know. We text each other. Quebec, something? I think Premier Legault is working on something right now, but I really encouraged Premier Legault to get that pipeline through Quebec. The last poll I saw was in the high 70s that people want that pipeline.
Keith? I mean, that's he again, kind of pulling that thread in anticipation of that meeting. I would say doing some heavy lifting for Carney there.
Absolutely. And signing these memorandum of understandings with other provinces and I mean, if he can walk into that first minister's meeting, if the prime minister can go in there and Doug Ford can present him with a series of these agreements between all the provinces and territories to do away with, I'm sure not all, but many of the agreements to get away with as many of their interprovincial trade barriers as they possibly can, to harmonize regulations across the country, all that sort of thing. That'd be a big leg up for the prime minister, big help for him, and a big boost for the country. So Ford is clearly doing his job as the chair of the Council of the Federation, the premiers and group, and is working clearly, very well with the prime minister, which we saw even during the election. He came under a lot of heat for, having a breakfast with the prime minister publicly in the Etobicoke riding during the election campaign. That doesn't matter to Doug Ford. He's willing to work with anyone, it seems, politically, and that's going to help him. Again, his ability to get along with the other stripes, I think, is his real strength. And so it doesn't matter what the political stripes are of the other premiers at the table. He's really pushing for a Canada-wide initiative here, get as united as you can. And by reaching out and, making the point several times that, Danielle Smith and Scott Moe have been ignored. For 10 years, they were treated very poorly. He's really going a long way, stepping out here and saying, come on, Prime Minister Carney, you want to show you're different than the Trudeau government? Here's where you have to start to show it. And it's going to be right there. And it's also going to be working with Quebec to get them to agree with the pipeline, to get C-69 out of the way. So it's ambitious, but if it can be done by July 1st, I'd be quite shocked, quite frankly. But if they can get the MOUs signed and lined up by that point, that again would be a huge leg up for the prime minister and for the country.
Well, John, it's almost like sort of this ambitious passive aggressive approach to Quebec too. Oh, we just lost John. I don't know where he went. But Kathleen, that sort of that sideways conversation directed towards Premier Legault, saying, well, he kind of let him off the hook. I think there's something going on there, and then kind of goes the populist route and says 70% of the people in Quebec kind of like this idea.
Yeah, and I think that was smart. I think that was a good gambit for Ford. Two things. I think that getting the memorandum of understanding signed, that's really important. Whether, well, I can say I think pretty categorically, all the changes are not going to be made by July 1st, but the outline can be there, and that's important. And then the work begins. It'll be interesting. The devil is in the details. I always talk about the Niagara wines and BC wines. If we can work out that conflict, we can probably work out anything. So I think he's absolutely on the right track, and I think being able to show that series of kind of framework agreements, I think that's really important. But I think the other thing is that there's no guarantee that that's going to do away with all of the tensions. For example, I don't think Doug Ford and Mark Carney, and I can stand to be corrected, but I don't think they will necessarily be on the same page in terms of laissez-faire around environmental protections. I think that Doug Ford has gone a long way in this province to remove environmental protections. We talked about Bill 5, which is going to further remove environmental protections for endangered species and so on. So Doug Ford's willing to go a very long way down the road to get rid of protections. I hope that the federal government's not willing to go that far. I hope that there will, whatever happens in terms of pipelines and the building of infrastructure, that we won't throw out, generations of protections that have been important to the environment of the country. So I think that there's going to be some, when the rubber hits the road a little bit on what's actually going to happen and how these infrastructure projects are going to be built and how this one economy is going to work. But look, at this stage, this is exactly what needs to happen. There needs to be the goodwill and the framework for agreement, and then you work out the details as you go along.
Yeah, well, and I think that came up because Keith, the premier, sent along his wish list this week for his 5 priorities, and much of it is, again, get this done, but it's all big infrastructure, big ambitious, transformational infrastructure that I don't think we can kind of ignore.
We just want things to move forward. We're in a different league now. We're fighting the tariffs, and we just want to get projects moving forward as quickly as possible. There's no longer time to sit around and wait 10 years as we do an EA and everything else. We just want to move forward with projects. This is a critical time for Ontario and Canada and the rest of the world up against these tariffs and on infrastructure. And we need to make sure we keep people working out there. And one way you do it is by building roads and highways and hospitals and schools and bridges.
And all that major infrastructure is obviously important, but even to the point around permitting, Keith, I mean, there's going to have to be some consistency from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I was up in Iqaluit the last month and spent a lot of time with the miners, and we're doing a show at Story Studio Network on the Arctic Edge, and we get down to it takes like 15, 16 years sometimes to get a permit to do the mining, never mind the mining itself. Right. So those things I can understand get in the way. So there's got to be some sweet spot there where we're respecting what Kathleen is saying about let's make sure we're not buggering up the habitat because, the First Nations folks rely on that fresh water and the wildlife that lives in that habitat. We can't just screw that up for the sake of putting a drill or a shovel in the ground.
Everyone seems to agree for the last decade, everyone except some of the First Nations communities in the area, that we need to develop the Ring of Fire. It's a huge priority for the government. The critical minerals that are there, the rare earth minerals that we want to get out, has to be done. Apparently, though, it's taken over 10 years to get a permit to do a 4-inch test core. That's just too long. And then, of course, again, 15 to 17 years. The Premier told this story the other day in one of his speeches, taking that long for something that a project of mine to actually get started. That has to stop. But on the other hand, the Premier's, 1 year, one permit sort of goal, I think, is a bit unrealistic. You just can't get the consultancy done. You can't consult the First Nations. You can't, do the proper environmental assessments. And of course, part of the Ontario bill of, get it done. I mean, building something faster. I forget what the actual name of it is. It actually repeals the Endangered Species Act, so that the government can, there'll be no environmental assessments essentially in a lot of these projects. One quick overview, but a species at risk is just going to get ignored. Oh, a little frog here, a little bit. They're just going to not care about that. The cabinet itself will make the decision on whether this species that's at risk, if found in some construction area, is going to be able to hold up that construction. The cabinet will make that decision, not based on recommendations coming in from experts, but based on what they want politically to get done. So I think there's certainly some dangers in getting there. I suspect Kathleen Wynne is correct that Mark Carney won't be willing to go as far as Doug Ford is in ignoring the environmental rules and regulations. But there will be something. There's going to have to be some movement between the feds and the provinces to agree on one sort of environmental assessment process and a time frame for those environmental processes on projects. Now, when you're getting something though like the Ring of Fire, it becomes much more complicated because it's not just somewhere we can just drive into. Getting the road built to that darn thing is problematic and taking forever, let alone getting the mine itself developed. So there's a lot of things, a lot of complications to deal with here. I'm sure the former Premier knows them much better than I do.
Well,
and to say you can do something in a year is just impossible.
No, but Keith, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're bang on. It's just the what's underneath the time that it takes to do these things is really important for us to recognize. So the notion that, First Nations are going to be protective of water, they're dependent on it and so on. We're all dependent on clean water. What happened in Grassy Narrows when Domtar was in there in the 60s has had ramifications right through to today. And, mercury in the river, Minamata disease among some of the kids and community members. We cannot let that happen again. In the conversations that I undertook for 2 years with the 9 Matawa First Nations in the Ring of Fire region, that was about who is going to do the permitting? How is that going to work? What are the environmental protections going to be? What is the economic benefit going to be to the communities? Because, we have not sorted out resource revenue sharing in this country, certainly not in this province. And those relationships are extremely important to being able to get these projects done in a way that is going to be safe, that is going to benefit the people who live in the region, and is going to allow us as a nation to move forward. So I just think we can't underestimate, we can't overestimate, I can't underestimate, whatever it is. We can't take for granted that it's just about moving quickly. It is about moving in the right way. It's about making sure that the people who are going to be most affected are part of the conversation. And maybe it's about changing the way the permitting works. And maybe it means bringing First Nations into that permitting process in a way that we haven't done in the past, right?
Well, I dare say that you know, not to get too far down the road and patting ourselves on the back, but again, we're doing this series on the Arctic, and it's centered on Nunavut, and Nunavut is essentially made the Inuit in that territory the largest landowners in the world, because that's like 20% of
the
Canada's
territory,
landmass, right? And I'm learning all of this as a result, but it gets to that point around how do you manage that? Nunavut should be a best practices opportunity for us when we talk about these things, right? And in that stage, the key there is that there are royalties involved, so that you know, it makes sense for the First Nations and the Inuit, the Indigenous. They have a not just a say, they have skin in the game, and they own the resource. Right. Yeah. So we've got to kind of use that, I think, as an example of how to do it right. And Kathleen, that's not just about economic development. That's about economic reconciliation.
Exactly. I mean, we can talk about reconciliation, have a reconciliation day, but this is where the relationship falters or grows, you know. And if we're not willing to change the way we do economic resource extraction, economic development in partnership, where First Nations have equity and some a modicum of self-governance over the territories that they live in, because that's what you're talking about. I've listened to your first couple of pods on the Arctic, and they're fantastic. And you know, the models in Nunavut and Greenland, interestingly, because Greenland is another territory where First Nations people have much more control and self-government governance over the fishery, for example, over their economic future. So we have a lot of work to do, and it does worry me that in these conversations, you know, in the projects that the Premier put forward, he put forward the nuclear projects, the tunneling under the 401, the Ring of Fire, expansion of GO, and then a James Bay deep sea port. Well, I can tell you the Ring of Fire and the James Bay deep sea port, and Keith, you may remember this, Gilles Bisson in 2008 was talking about the need for development on the James Bay coast, but that will not happen without, you know, the Moose Cree, the First Nations around Moose Factory and up the James Bay coast being involved in those conversations in a real way, not in a token way, not in a sort of consultative, like performative way, but in a real way in terms of what their future is going to look like, depending on how those things are developed. They're just not going to happen otherwise. So we better wrap our minds around that as a province and a country. And I don't think we have, certainly at the provincial level with this government.
John Wright back with us. We lost you somewhere down a rabbit hole on the internet, but welcome back in. I don't know how much you heard while you were away, but this whole idea of getting things done, I think, is central. And you talk to anybody, and we'll look at that list of 5 priorities, and maybe the tunnel is the one that people say, oh, well, we don't need that. But the other 4 are pretty important. And rather than looking at it as obstacles, I think we need to look at these things as an opportunity. So similar to the way we're talking about opportunity vis-a-vis interprovincial trade barriers and how we can eliminate them for the better of the economy, there's an opportunity here to get back to Kathleen's point with First Nations and Indigenous communities to say this is how it should be done, and really rely on their intelligence and their traditional knowledge to be able to say this is how you do it here.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm glad I just came in on the tail end of that, because it echoed exactly what I was going to be saying, because I think we were talking, it started out with the West and the demands and all that sort of stuff. And I'm sorry, one of my, the internet connector went down. You know, I'll just be very brief on this. Begin always with the preface that my father was born in Edmonton, so genetically I'm connected to the province somehow. So even when I criticize it, that should be taken into account. I think what's fascinating to me is that we all there's a lot of politicians who scream and yell at the federal government, and rightly so at certain times, and especially under the last prime minister, in my view. But there are complicated pieces in order to get everything that Premier Wynne just said done. Like, I mean, if you want to build a pipeline that goes all the way out to the Atlantic, you're going to have to get Quebec on side. I mean, you scream all you want at the federal government for not making it happen, but you've got to do that. Secondly, all of the Indigenous agreements that have to be made. But I think it's also the case that the former prime minister spent more time flying over Alberta and Saskatchewan than actually going to Alberta and Saskatchewan. And it has caused an enormous rift in this country. So I understand, when the premier of Alberta sort of throws all this stuff on the table and in a way is threatening, if we're not looked after and we don't get that pipeline going north and west and east and the 300 billion back that we've missed out on because we've had, tankers that can't come into from the Pacific to the coast and all that sort of stuff. And it creates, again, when you add it to what Premier Ford is doing, it's a huge list of stuff you got to deal with. So I don't envy anybody who's trying to sort that out in the prime minister's office. But the reality is that each one of these decisions is codependent on provinces, provincial jurisdiction, and on Indigenous or First Nations treaties. Even they weighed in when Daniel Smith said, we might be out of here. And they said, oh, not so fast. So we're I'm just going to answer this not on the substance of it, but on the character and the tone of it. We're at a stage right now where, again, the new prime minister of this country is going to have to enter the provincial room and actually do the sidebar with the premier of Alberta, which he's already done encouragingly, we understand. But it's going to have to be massaged. We have to take a fresh look at this country. It's being given the opportunity to do so because of what Donald Trump is doing to us. Who would have thought we could say by July the 1st, all these federal trade barriers are going to be done? They're going to be done. But we have to take into perspective that you can scream all you want at certain people to get things done, but they're stuck in mud because other people will not let them get this done. And I think this is a fundamental understanding that we're going to have to get across to everybody. That's why I think it's going to take longer. But it's up to the prime minister when he walks into that room and he deals with these things.
You're muted, John. You just muted your mic. But I think we got your point.
He's just setting a new tone for this country.
Yeah, but Keith, here's the thing, and again, I'll go back to the Doug Ford mantra: get it done. The prime minister has to do the same thing. He has to have the same level of urgency, to John's point. And there is low-hanging fruit here on some of these projects. For example, last week, 2 weeks ago, Manitoba and Nunavut, they signed an agreement to run a hydro line from northern Manitoba into Nunavut. And that might not sound like a big deal to us folks who live here in beautiful downtown Don Mills, but they are not attached to the grid in that part of the world. They run everything on diesel, right? So for all of their efforts to, take care and be stewards of the land, that's a huge carbon footprint because they're spewing out all the garbage from the diesel burn. All they need now is the feds to say, we're signing on. And it would make it that, again, low-hanging fruit. And it would accomplish so many things. The security of the economy, the security, the sovereignty in the Arctic, the actual carbon footprint of all the industry that's going on in Nunavut, for example. So there are opportunities here for this government right now, within weeks, to sign off and say, big project done, let's move on to the next one.
Electricity transmission lines as low-hanging fruit is a unique concept, and I'm sure Kathleen Wynne is wondering about that as well, because they're notoriously difficult to get built. But in this area, of course, it's vastly needed. But the benefit, if we could get actual electricity grid generation to so many of our First Nations communities that are not only relying on the diesel, they're then breathing it in all day long.
Yeah.
It's all like there's just hovering over the communities because they have to rely on diesel for everything, including powering their water, everything. It's just insane. So if we could actually get those communities onto the provincial grids, that'd be huge. It would be a massive, and again, if we can get more lines, if there's more areas where they can get these big infrastructure projects started and going, I can't imagine many objections from the First Nations communities if we can get them hooked up to those lines. So there's some instant payback for everyone. The environment is absolutely going to be beneficial from it for everybody if we stop burning diesel to run so many of these communities. But just think of what it would be like in your community to just smell diesel all day long, 24 hours a day. You're breathing it in, you're breathing it out, and you can't rely on anything. If you run out of diesel, you're waiting till the next plane flies in. It's insane. So if we can get these kind of major infrastructure projects off the ground, pipelines are going to take a long time to get going, perhaps the length of the government. So we're going to need something faster, bigger, and it's not going to be a tunnel under the 401. The feasibility study, maybe, but it's not going to be that tunnel. If there can be actual progress on more GO trains, on actually getting the road built to the Ring of Fire, and perhaps even getting the drills into the Ring of Fire, that kind of stuff would be huge. But I don't know how much of it is actually low hanging fruit. It looks like it could be because everyone wants these projects, but when you actually go to start them, it gets incredibly complicated right away.
But
Well,
can I just make a process comment, Dave? And Keith, you guys would all know this. At any given moment in government, there are, in each ministry, each department, there are projects that are almost ready to go, or they are ready to go. They just need sign off. You know, one of the things that I think Prime Minister Mark Carney will probably do is say, okay, what do we have that's been sitting on the back burner that could be brought forward, like the project you're talking about, Dave, that would signal how quickly we're going to move, how committed we are to getting these things done. I really believe that in every department there are these ideas that have become more than an idea, and where the work has been done in terms of the partnerships. So let's bring those forward. If I were in the Prime Minister's seat, that's what I would be doing. It's something that I did in our government in particular instances. But I think that right now is a moment to say, okay, this is everyone, on the same page, bringing forward projects that are worthy, that will make a difference. I'm not just saying, facetious sort of things or frills. I'm talking about real things that will demonstrate partnerships that can go forward, and let's get on those and get them moving.
And the interesting part of that hydro link, it's a fiber line too, Keith. So that this is high speed internet, and the people I talk to in Nova, we're all kind of sheepishly. It's kind of like the Tesla owners, because they rely on Starlink. Yeah, that's the name of it. And they're all going, oh, geez, I guess we got to do it. But that would just change life incredibly. I mean, there was internet service up there, but it was, really sluggish and difficult. But there's also a sense, Keith, that when we have these conversations, that the First Nations are standing in the way of progress, that they don't want any of this to happen. That is just not true.
Yeah. All they'd really like is a little respect and perhaps an equity stake. It's that simple. If they can get something where it's going to not only benefit their community and everyone's going to, but that they can see that they're going to get some jobs out of this, some jobs training, some permanent management positions, that companies can be opened up. It's not just going to be, Southern companies coming in, doing the development, and then pulling out and leaving their own management teams in place. They need equity stake for these First Nations to make it really, they want these projects. Of course they want these projects. And as I was just saying, who wants to be breathing diesel fuel all day long? Electricity, imagine where you could depend on it. Most of us do. They can't. I mean, those kind of things would make a huge difference, but they have to be given the respect. It's not just about consulting. It's about bringing them into the projects at the very beginning and having them understand and bring their suggestions into it. If it should have a different route because of this is a traditional territory for whatever, then let's talk about that. Have that at the beginning, not coming in and find out what our plans go right through traditional hunting grounds or whatever. The respect, the level of consultation, it has to be done, but it can be done if it's started at the beginning on the big project, so it doesn't come in and sort of, start as an interruptive phase, as someone trying to, as you say, perceived as trying to block the development. No, get them at the very beginning and have them on side from the beginning, because it's a benefit to them, and not just from the actual infrastructure project itself, but from the whole project, from the benefit for all.
Well, I will refer you all who are watching, listening to the Arctic Edge, because we do talk about a lot of these things. And, you talk about the traditional hunting grounds, what the miners do to accommodate the caribou migration, to make sure that, and this is not just ticking a box. It's because the elders from the Inuit community actually attend at the mines on a regular basis to make sure that we're doing this, that the wellness plans are done, that the workforce is taken care of. And there's a lot of Inuit youth who are being employed there. So to your point, Keith, it's not about, ticking the box to make sure we're patting people on the head. It's about making sure that whatever investment happens stays in the community. It doesn't just extract it from the community and goes elsewhere. So yeah, I as I said, John, I think based on this and where we are, as you point out in terms of tone, I think there's real opportunity here. It's not going to be easy, but there's real opportunity here.
Yeah, but we also have to put in the measure of time.
Sure.
So, I mean, you flick the switch and we're looking at something like John Kennedy saying, one of these days we'll return a man safely from the moon. Well, okay, how long did that take? You might as well build it into this process. If you're trying to do stuff like build pipelines across the country, even if Alberta, decided to separate, they'd have to deal, with their neighbors with a whole bunch of things too. And I just think, where were we a decade ago? Well, a decade ago, Prime Minister Trudeau wasn't here. Doug Ford wasn't here. Almost every premier wasn't here. The parties have changed. The priorities from climate change all of a sudden have changed to, clean oil, and we got to get it out. I mean, so much can happen in that time frame. Again, I go back to this, and I agree with Premier Wynne on this. There are clearly those things figuratively in the pipeline of government that they can take out and say, look, we have the intent to do something here, and we're going to light these things now. And for the longer process, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But it's going to take Alberta and Saskatchewan and everybody else to recognize that when the switches go on here, we may be looking at an effect that doesn't happen until a decade from now, or even longer if the premier changes in one of those provinces where things are going to go through. So I'm just saying that, I agree with Alberta that they have been shunned and that there's all kinds of legislation which shut them down because of a priority on climate change, which all of a sudden doesn't seem to be anything that anybody's talking about. But the reality is we all have to work with people. It's not just interprovincial barriers that exist, but there's interpersonal barriers that exist. And there's also barriers with respect to the stability of politics, because if you look at Quebec, there's going to be an election soon and it may be a whole new regime. So these are the things that Prime Minister Carney walks into. And as I said right from the outset, the visceral part of all of this is, what is he like? How is he going to determine what personalities he's got in the room and how he can address each one of those? So again, Prime Minister Mark Carney, to me, is his own ecosystem. I'm watching it develop as it goes week by week. And hopefully we can have a meeting with the premiers where everybody walks out of the room and goes, well, that was a start, and we can get on with it. I think that will be the most positive thing for this country if he can do it.
Well, I think just coincidentally, Kathleen, Carney has Aaron Corey in running the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and you had him as the head of Infrastructure Ontario at the time. And I remember dealing with him because I was working with the P3 Council in those days. And, the P3 Council would talk about their shovel-ready projects. And I know that was a sort of a phrase and a mantra that came out of Infrastructure Ontario. But when you talk to Aaron about this thing, he says, I don't care what you call it, a P3. I just want to get shit built. So that was kind of the attitude. And I think there's a role there based on what the Infrastructure Bank has the opportunity to do, again, around transformational infrastructure. It wouldn't surprise me at all to see more conversation at that level with I think probably a tool that's been underused.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's been some tarnishing of the notion of the P3 kind of
thank you, cross
model.
Okay, yeah.
The Eglinton cross, whatever. I mean, but the fact is that we got dozens of infrastructure projects built around the province using our version of that model, where the public ownership remained in place. And I agree, the shovel-ready projects, that's exactly what I'm talking about, Dave. Where are we ready to go, where the partnerships are in place, where the community understands what's happening, where that background work has been done. Let's move on those things. So there's an element of urgency that needs to be injected into all of this now. And I think even John, you're talking about the fact that nobody's talking about climate change, and those things have, so much has changed. But the fact is that those issues are still and even more urgent. So part of the task right now is to be building infrastructure that can adapt to the new realities of climate change. I mean, there's a whole industry in that alone, and so those things don't have to be at odds. Actually, we can talk about it in a different way, but I think that some of those underlying issues are still going to drive the need for decent infrastructure to be built.
Yeah, future-proofing your assets when you're talking about 50 or 60 years of an investment in an infrastructure project. That's something to consider. So, okay, well, we didn't get to the measles, but we'll deal with that next week. And I think we need to have a larger conversation around Bill 5, because that's we've been touching on that all the way around so many of these things. I have no stomach for omnibus bills, but other than that, we'll get into that and other things. Kathleen Wynne, thank you for being here. John Wright, thanks for rejoining. It was good to have you be able to jump back in. And Keith Leslie and our friend Tim Hudak will be back, he promises, next week. So we're looking forward to that. And as always, when he's not here, we miss his presence. But all right, so two things. First, if you are listening on the podcast apps, make sure you subscribe, follow, whatever it is. Leave a comment. That'd be great. Watching on YouTube, you might listen on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. There's this show and Now and Next in there. And if you're listening on the radio, I'm telling you, you're getting 42 minutes of content on the radio. This is more than an hour-long show. So we talk about a lot more on the podcast than you hear on the radio. Happy to have you listen on the radio. But if you want more, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel or the podcast channel. So thanks for being here. It's always good to have your input on this. I'm Dave Trafford. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics Podcast.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.